Welcome to Basta Stories, where real-life horror and true ghost stories come to life, from haunted forests to chilling encounters with the darkest parts of human nature. Each episode dives into the terrifying and unexplained. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. So turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and ask yourself, are you really alone?
I used to believe that if you get the costume right, the world will understand the joke. Pink nail polish, prom-ready curls, a username that sounded like a tiara, then logging into a place built for obsidian, hearts, and smudged eyeliner. The subversion was my shield. It worked. Until someone decided the costume meant I was breakable. I wasn't the first girl on the Marilyn Manson BBS to lean hard into contradiction. But I learned fast that contrast draws a crowd. The forum felt like a warehouse where the lights were always dimmed. Several sub-threads, each a hallway with graffiti made of inside jokes, movie quotes, and arguments that never truly ended. In that light, I glittered on purpose. I posted about set lists and lyric meanings pinned beside photos of centerpieces from a spring formal. The irony set me free. It also made me visible. Perfect. Skinny puppy. Stigma, and Katie, names that sounded like they could bruise you or guard you, lifted me into the inner ring. They watched how I handled verbal elbows, how I volleyed snark without pretending it wasn't play. 3 of them. Perfect. Skinny, and Katie were quietly within walking distance of my actual locker. We weren't cafeteria friends, but we were hallway allies. It felt safe enough to admit that, in that same light. I attracted the swarm. Celibate Adam, Mugwump, Cranboy, Derek. People whose avatars stared like unblinking portraits. They teased, probed, tried on meanness like a jacket. I fit mine just as easily. Across that noise, one handle began to appear in a different way. Geordie Dark. He was all edges that pretended to be softness, thick glasses, a mustache stuck in a decade it never left, sideburns and hair that fell into the kind of mullet you can't perform into existence. You have to live a certain life to keep it. His pictures were grainy, underlit, the kinds of images that make rooms look smaller. He didn't come in swinging. He left brief traces under my posts, single-word acknowledgments that read like a person clearing their throat without wanting attention. When he messaged, it was courteous in the beginning. We talked about the finite canon. People like us canonize anyway. The Blair Witch Project. Manson eras. Hole's snarled sweetness. The X-Files habit of taking the shape of your fear. It was ordinary, then oddly devotional, somewhere inside those conversations. He decided to draft me into a story I did not consent to inhabit. The girl in distress, the one you cradle out of gloom. He misread my glitter as a mask for a darkness that needed an audience. and he cast himself as the audience that would heal it. There is a violence in the way a stranger defines you to your face and insists you agree. It's the kind that arrives in paragraphs. I said I didn't need saving. He explained that I couldn't say that because of what I was going through. Pause here. Notice what they do when you say no. That's the whole story, folded into one test. He began to show up under everything I wrote, an echo that wanted ownership. If someone shoved me verbally, he'd mount a defense that sounded less like loyalty and more like a sermon he'd been itching to deliver. It didn't make me safer. It made me false. I had learned to breathe in the rough and tumble of that board. His version of protection said I was too fragile to sit at my own table. I told him to stop. He said that I didn't know what was best for myself. That medication had made me numb. I did not have a prescription to point to. It didn't matter. He had a script, and he was reading it at me. The forum had no block button. Ethics were an unspoken thing. We policed one another with humiliation. My friends and I dragged his posts into the open, where the light stung. We labeled him what his behavior asked us to: creep, weirdo, a tourist in a savior complex. He didn't flinch. He kept posting portraits that looked like they were developed inside a locked bathroom. Then, a private message arrived with the tone of a wedding vow no one asked for. He forgave me for the cruelty of others. He would come for me. He would not let them shape our life together. When a promise arrives, wearing the wrong kind of tenderness, believe what your body says. Step back. One of the things that happens online is the math of obsession. People mistake repetition for intimacy. They think showing up is the same as being permitted to stand close. At school, I measured my days in the practical. Which quiz I hadn't studied for? Who had borrowed my notes? What time my mom's sister might call from another state with another chaotic update about a move, a new boyfriend, a new detox plan. That morning felt neutral. The air tasted like pencil shavings and those industrial cleaners schools use that leave no scent at all. Just a sterile after sensation when the slip from the office arrived. Your dad is here. There's a family emergency. I felt a small, impolite ripple. My father had been a door that closed when I was 3. My stepfather, Leon, was a collection of reliable habits, not a title. I imagined a clerical error. I imagined a mild crisis with my aunt that would turn into a long drive and a story for later. The front office was fluorescent and busy with small tasks. No Leon. The secretary pointed at the parking lot with weathered sympathy and said she was sorry to hear about my aunt. The corridor from reception to outside is longer when you're rehearsing what to say to a person you care about, but don't call by a name that belongs to the past. I stepped into the open, and the day widened around a single image. A camper van that looked abandoned by time and then recommissioned by someone who didn't believe in washing. Ever. The paint was a collage of faded flowers and crude art that tried to turn a vehicle into a dare. A man leaned on it like a bad idea, learning to stand up straight. My mind did split screen. The photographs of Geordie Dark on my screen versus the man in front of me. The overlap was undeniable and wrong. It was as if the pixels had aged 3 decades in transit. His hair was long, but drained of color. His mustache drew attention to a mouth that looked practiced at sweet talk and threats. His face recorded everything. Nothing had interrupted. Late nights, cheap liquor, the long wear of a person who wants without earning. He saw me, and a frantic joy traveled across his features in a way I recognized from his messages. The relief of a fantasy that thinks it has located its proof. He said my username, the sound of it outside, with sky and asphalt as audience, felt obscene, like someone reading my diary on a sidewalk. I moved backward. He stepped forward and began to recite the rescue. He told me we were leaving filth. He told me I had suffered enough. He told me that he had come exactly when I needed him, because of course he had, when I asked him to stop. He reached for my wrist, not hard enough to bruise instantly, but with the certainty of a person who believes he has a right to guide a body. I asked for help in a voice that had learned to be clear. A friend turned her head. A teacher set down a clipboard. The air around us focused. Geordie tightened and began to tug me toward the van. I thought, very calmly, about the interior, about curtains that could be drawn, about locks that would be quick, about the way silence becomes a weapon in small spaces. Anchor to the detail that keeps you present. The metal of his rings against your skin is cold. The door to the office is still open. You can name 2 people who saw you walk out here. I pulled away and said his grip was not allowed. He looked startled, then offended, as if I had failed a script that had always given him his cue. He tried again, this time. A different script cut through what he was saying. A voice behind us, familiar and decisive, told him to let go. The skateboard hit his back with a dull practicality that did not need sound effects to testify to force. His hand released me. Katie's bag, with 4 years of patches and a few metal badges that made it heavy in just the right way, met the side of his head. He staggered. Perfect. Small. Quick. Underestimated. Stepped in and pressed Geordie's arms behind him, using leverage, not size, to move him forward. He guided Geordie into the side of a minivan with the kind of precision you learn when life trains you to turn your frame into a brace. Geordie slid to the ground. Perfect held him there, not punishing, just preventing. The scene rearranged itself around scents again. Adults approached with purposeful strides. Someone called campus security. My friends shepherded me several steps away and searched my face for damage. I said I was whole. The word felt both true and aspirational. It took a breath to name who the man was. When I said it, Geordie. From the BBS, the three of them blinked, then processed what they had just done without knowing why they had done it. The relief that followed made my legs feel unreliable for a moment, as if I'd been holding all my weight somewhere other than my feet. In the hours that followed, cops asked questions, gathered statements, and filled forms with the slow gravity of grown-ups doing the right thing inside the limits that bind them. The forum, once home to our chaos, became the place where we finally chose bureaucracy. We reported Geordie. An admin made the choice we'd asked for earlier and banned him. The adrenaline bled from the day and left behind a bruise you couldn't point to. We didn't post the story publicly. We didn't want to invite the internet into our zip code. I lay in bed that night and tried to reverse engineer his method. Did I tell him the name of the school? Had I dropped a landmark by accident? Had he scrolled through hundreds of possibilities until the camper van got lucky? The brain hates unanswered questions. It will write harmful fictions to close any loop it finds. I refused to write the one that gave him mastery. I wrote a different sentence. I am not the girl he decided I was. There's a temptation to grant meaning to someone else's obsession. If they worked this hard, the story must matter. It doesn't. It's just persistence without permission. Geordie insisted, even in custody, that I had invited him. He said I had asked him to come to the school. He said that I was confused, and that once I saw the interior of his van, everything would make sense. People like him talk as if privacy is a fog that will break at noon. They promise clarity after the boundary is already crossed. In the days that followed, I learned more about the shape of consequences than I had learned in any civics class. The word assault moved around like a chess piece that belonged to no one. Geordie floated threats through channels we heard about secondhand. If we pressed this, he would press that, filing something against Perfect for restraint, against Skinny for using a skateboard as a tool, against Katie for deploying a bag as a weight. The police had their hands full with things that bled and shattered. A girl forcibly led toward a van by a man who had traveled to find her and who believed he owned her rescue sites in a gray area until a more visible harm registers. The case did not go to a courtroom I could sit in. The forum thread that might have immortalized the day did not exist. We chose not to write it. Instead, we made small choices. We adjusted the privacy ribs of our online lives, even though back then those ribs were flimsy. We learned to talk in a vocabulary that kept people like him from climbing inside our sentences. We practiced not feeding the story when the ban notice appeared. It was 2 lines of mercy. ours, not his. I wanted punishment, and I also wanted an eraser. Neither is real in the way I imagined. I carried a heavier understanding and a lighter backpack. Both were useful. If you're waiting for me to say, I never logged in again, I can't. The forum had been a place where I felt understood inside the joke and outside it. The day after, my friends were there, which meant I was there. The thread titles were unchanged. The arguments were half resumed. Someone had posted a grainy live rip with a timestamp that didn't align with the set list. Life makes room for horror by refusing to stop being ordinary. I kept my username. I kept my glitter. I hardened the edges that needed hardening. Not because I wanted to be less soft, but because I wanted to choose when softness was offered. Remember this: the person who tries to rename you is announcing the only thing you need to know, that they believe their fantasy outranks your biography. The school year moved forward. Perfect, skinny. And Katie graduated. We hugged in a parking lot that had a new gravity for me. The van was gone. The imprint remained. A private map. A warning label I carry on the inside of my wrist where he tried to steer me. Leon didn't ask for a new title. He kept being himself, which is a better promise than any dramatic vow. My mom watched me more closely for a while, a scrutiny I tolerated because love wears worry when it has to. People told me I was lucky. I agreed, then didn't. Luck is what you say when you can't explain a narrow corridor. What actually happened was practice. I had learned how to refuse, and I had learned who would run when I needed them. That's not luck. That's community rehearsed into instinct, sometimes at night. When the ceiling looks like a paused television, I run a different loop than the one Geordie wanted. In mine. The office finds a better policy. In mine. The forum had a block button years earlier. In mine. The van never gets past the entrance, but looping is a trance that leaves you walking in circles. So I anchor to the only sequence that matters. I said, stop. He didn't. Someone else said stop. He had to. And then we chose not to let the worst thing he tried become the most interesting thing about me. Close the door. Keep the handle visible to yourself. Keep walking. The strangest part of an almost crime is the paperwork it still demands. You answer questions that feel like riddles. What? Exactly. Did he say before he touched you? How far did you move under your own power? Which hand? Describe the pressure. Each detail is a map that refuses to draw the territory it matters to most. Fear arriving inside a routine. The officer who took my statement had a calm voice and a pen that left confident lines. He asked me to speak slowly. He asked me to correct him if he rephrased. Behind him hung a bulletin board, layered with phone numbers, and a flyer advertising a self-defense class. whose stock photo made everything look harmless. I spoke, then rewound, then spoke again. It is not natural to narrate your own body position to a stranger under fluorescent panels. But I did, because I wanted the record to exist, even if it never became a verdict. At home, my mother performed the ritual of a parent trying not to panic in front of a child who is no longer a child. She made practical lists. Call the school, call the police liaison, call Leon's friend who knows a lawyer, call the neighbor to see if she saw that van earlier. Leon brought home groceries and a second lock for the front door. He didn't call himself father and didn't try to rename what I felt. He tightened a hinge, then sat on the floor and asked me to walk through the day again so he could put the bolts where they belong. The ordinary kindness made me want to cry more than the shock did. Online, the investigation had a different texture. An admin with a handle that once made me laugh now became a point of contact who needed timestamps, links, screenshots where I had them. We were a community built on masks. But suddenly, we were asked to prove the flesh. A BBS without a block feature is a character in the story, whether it likes the role or not. The backlog of Geordie's comments looked tedious and inevitable in the archive. His insistence, my refusals, the escalation, the vow to and rescue me, underlined by the lazy cruelty of a man who didn't believe consequences were real. Rumors began, because rumors are the default operating system of any place with usernames. Some said Geordie was a fake, and that the photos had always been a bit. Some said a rival board was trying to embarrass us. Some said I had invented it for attention. I read some of it, then taught myself to stop. Pattern interruption saves you. Change the tab, change the room, drink water. Tell your brain, respond only to signals you authorize. The trance loop that anxiety starts. Check again, read again, scroll again, needs a counterspell. Mine was physical. A 5-minute walk outside. A slow inventory of what I could see. The exact weight of a key in my palm. At school, the principal wanted to talk about protocols. He used words that sounded important and words that sounded cautious. He asked if I felt safe enough to keep attending. I said yes, because the alternative felt like letting the story evict me. He nodded and said he was proud of the way my friends had intervened, while also reminding me that physical force can complicate things. I looked at the thin line running down the center of Skinny's broken skateboard deck and decided some complications are worth it. Geordie did not vanish completely, at least not in the places where gossip travels. A friend of a friend said he had seen the van near a motel by the highway. Another claimed he'd heard that the man was only visiting town for a day. None of it changed how I moved through the world. Which is to say, I added a layer of attention and refused to let it become my only layer. When fear tries to turn you into a detective in your own life, choose instead to be a witness. Observe. Record. Refuse the promotion to paranoia. I sent one last message to the admin and asked that my report stay on file, even if nothing further happened. He said it would. He said he was sorry. He said he had a daughter. He did not say he would fix the code to make blocking possible. Some lessons arrive one patch at a time. There is a difference between rescue and control. And teenagers often learn it in kinetic ways. The rescue I wanted was the one that returned me to myself. The control Geordie offered was a door closing behind me in a van with curtains and an itinerary written by someone else. Perfect. Skinny. And Katie became the kind of friends whose names you feel in your posture. We didn't turn the incident into a legend. We turned it into a contract. The clauses were simple. We would walk each other to our cars. We would text when we got home. We would check in if something felt off. We would correct any story told about us without our consent. We would keep our jokes sharp, but never point the blade at one another. We did not carve these rules into a table. We performed them until they felt like muscle memory. That is anchoring, choosing behaviors you can return to until the returning is automatic. I brought cupcakes to thank them, and they rolled their eyes in the way people do when they would have helped you without being thanked. Katie wanted to know if I was sleeping. Skinny wanted to know if I had bruises. Perfect wanted to know if I wanted to change my username. I did not. I wanted to be visible to myself the way I had chosen to be. That is another kind of rescue. When people heard about what happened in fragments, they sometimes tried to turn my friends into heroes, the way movies do. Slow motion, a soundtrack, a headline. They refused the medal. They said a sentence I loved. We were already running. That was true. They were already moving toward me, long before they saw me. Friendship is a preloaded decision. On the forum, I drafted a post I never published. It began, "This is a public service announcement about private boundaries." It listed 3 embedded commands I now live by. Trust your instincts. Say the quiet no out loud. Exit early and without apology. I let the post sit in my drafts as a reminder that I do not owe an education to those committed to pretending not to know. Teaching is generous. Survival is not a curriculum. Leon asked if I wanted to learn a basic class in self-defense, and I surprised myself by saying yes. The first time I practiced the motion of breaking a grip at the wrist, the room tilted. Not because I doubted my strength, but because the movement pulled a thread back to the parking lot. The instructor noticed the way I went quiet. He had the good sense to correct only my stance and not my face. I learned where my center of gravity actually is, how to step into the space control tries to steal, how to orient my hips so power travels through me without apology. The lesson was simple and complicated. Hold your ground in a way that lets your ground move. I started writing again. Not posts and not DMs, but a notebook that took the place of the looping thoughts the incident tried to fund. The pages collected ordinary detail. The ketchup stain that looked like a country on a cafeteria napkin. The feeling of the second lock clicking. The exact pattern of stickers on Katie's bag. Sensory overload can be a weapon turned against you. It can also be a reclamation if you choose which details to flood yourself with. I was teaching my brain new highlights. If you're waiting for Geordie to come back in this chapter, he does not get to. That is the point. The story bends away from him and toward the people and practices that make my life mine. This is not an evasion. It is a correction. Graduation for the others arrived as a series of RSVPs and borrowed gowns. We took photos in a parking lot that had once been a stage. The minivan that had caught Geordie had a faint scuff where Perfect's leverage had pressed a shoulder into metal. The mark looked like a comet had skimmed the paint. I decided not to ask the owner for permission to keep loving that flaw. I changed small things online. I kept the username I had chosen, but retired certain phrases that had become magnets. I learned to use private messages the way a city uses alleyways. Carefully, purposefully, with an awareness of what belongs in public sunlight instead. I answered fewer strangers. I answered myself more. I stayed, which felt radical when departure would have been easy and maybe even earned. Staying is underrated. It says you will not invent a new address every time someone attaches a lie to your name. Leon kept making dinner like nothing had happened, and like everything had happened. My mother stopped hovering so closely that I could feel the outline of her. She started hovering in wider arcs that left me room to move, but still kept me on her map. I slept with the window cracked and a chair still under the doorknob. Because rituals matter more than the objects they use, I walked to school with the same playlist and an added sense of how the sidewalks meet at the corners. I'm not trying to make caution poetic. I'm saying caution can be integrated without letting it decorate every sentence. On the forum, new controversies replaced the old ones. A rumor about a tour date, a fight about a lyric, an elaborate post about set list theory that included graphs. I laughed again at the screen. Skinny DM'd me a photo of a new board with a joke about its warranty. Katie sent a picture of a patch shaped like a shield. Perfect typed a sentence that read like a thesis. We do not owe anyone clarity about our boundaries. The boundary is the clarity. I kept the camper van in my mind as a cautionary museum exhibit, a vehicle of someone else's plan. When fear suggested I needed to populate the museum with more exhibits, I said no. You get one display. You get glass around it. You do not get a gift shop. The brain loves souvenirs from danger. I refused to sell any. Years later, when the forums, as we knew them, had thinned out, and most conversations became comment sections attached to faces. I told this story in a room where faces were real and name tags clipped at the shoulder. I watched people recognize themselves in the architecture, if not the plot. Everyone has a van, even if theirs never drove all the way to the curb. Everyone has a friend who is already running. The lesson travels better than the details. If you came here looking for revenge, I don't have it. I have something sturdier. I have a vocabulary that keeps me intact and a map that keeps me moving. I kept the glitter. I kept the jokes. I kept the part of me he mistook for a wound, and I called it by its right name, style. The boundary is not a wall. It is a filter I manage. The person who believes they can rename me will always be wrong, even if they shout my username across a parking lot. I am not the girl he decided I was. I am the narrator. That is not just a literary term. It is a job description. I choose the emphasis. I choose the end of this chapter. I choose to end it with the same sentence that kept me standing in the place where the sky was too bright and the van was too close. I said, "Stop." He didn't. We made him. Then we left, not with a flourish, but with a practice and a door we keep open for one another. There are memories you bury so deep, you almost convince yourself they never happened, until something, a sound, a name, a song, claws them back to the surface, and you realize they were never gone, just waiting for years. I told myself that what happened to me, my sister, and my mom was a twisted, isolated nightmare, the kind of thing you hear about in true crime podcasts, not something that unfolds in your own living room. I've stayed silent, thinking if I locked it away, it couldn't hurt me anymore. But silence doesn't erase the past. It just gives the rot time to spread in the dark. It all started in the early 2000s, when the internet felt like a new frontier, exciting, boundless, and dangerous in ways we didn't fully understand. Back then, AOL Instant Messenger wasn't just a chat program. It was a gateway to entire worlds, and somewhere inside that glowing screen, I met someone who I thought would become one of the most important friends of my teenage years. Her name was Gloria. At least, that's what she said. She came into my life quietly, almost casually, through a friend request on a platform where strangers didn't feel dangerous. They felt like discoveries. And for months, she was my confidant, my late-night companion, the voice in my ear when the rest of the house was asleep. I had no way of knowing that Gloria wasn't who she claimed to be, and I definitely wasn't ready for the truth. A truth that would rip through the fragile trust I had in the people closest to me, and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about safety, family, and love back then. The family computer lived in a shared corner of the house, like a piece of furniture you weren't supposed to move. Heavy monitor, humming tower, a desk drawer full of blank CDs and tangled cords. The glow from that screen had its own weather. After a while, you learned to read it. The white of a fresh chat window, the pale blue of a clean inbox, the faint gray that meant your connection had slipped and the world had gone quiet. It felt like standing at the edge of a map and watching new land sketch itself in as you walked. AOL, Instant Messenger, made that new land feel navigable. You built a tiny version of yourself out of a username, a buddy icon, and an away message that pretended to be poetry. Your screen name was a promise and a disguise. Mine was the kind of name a 15-year-old picks because it looks clever, typed out in lowercase. And I wore it the way you wear a jacket you think makes you braver. I curated a friends list like it was a passport. Classmates, friends of friends, the friend of a cousin who shared mixtapes, a boy from a summer camp I barely remembered. People flowed in through features that should never have existed. Little discovery tools designed to pair strangers because the future still believed strangers were mostly safe. There were rules, but they were folklore, passed down by older kids and siblings. Never meet alone, never send a home address, never download a file you didn't ask for. We repeated those rules the way people repeat a prayer, half for comfort, half because we loved the thrill of not obeying perfectly. We weren't careful. We were curious. And curiosity felt like agency, like building your own door and stepping through it. Gloria arrived through one of those doors. A friend request first. No context. Just a handle that sounded like a name your grandmother might have. Attached to a small square photo that could have been a yearbook crop. I remember thinking the name didn't match the tone of her messages. She wrote like someone my age, quick, a little sardonic, equal parts confident and confessional. She showed up after 9 most nights, the hour when the house began to slow and the kitchen light went off, when you could hear your own breathing and the chime of a message could rewire your pulse. She explained the late hours easily. Clubs, obligations, a stepmother who enforced strict rules. She never dramatized it. She framed it as routine, the way some people present a bruise as the result of walking into a door. We traded stories the way kids trade stickers. Careful at first, then bold. She asked about music, teachers, the minor humiliations of the school day. I asked about the town she claimed, the streets she said she biked, the mystery of the absent biological father and the mother who lived far away. She had answers for everything, pared down and plausible. When she didn't know, she pivoted and asked about me as if the question had been the point all along. I was good at talking in abstractions, pretending honesty with carefully chosen details. she was better at it. The platforms we used made deception easy by making intimacy easy. Buddy lists lit up with green dots. Profiles carried just enough biographical noise to convince you you'd met a person. I'd seen 2 scanned photos of Gloria, one a stiff school portrait, the other a candid where sunlight cut across half her face. She'd seen the awkwardness of my own class picture and told me it made me look smarter than I felt. That kind of comment is cheap in adulthood. At 15, it felt like recognition. I kept my real life divided into safe compartments. Family was one, the internet was another. I told Gloria about Lacey because sisters don't fit in compartments, and because it felt easier to admit fear to a person who couldn't watch your face change. Lacey was older, high-achieving, stretched thin by the finish line of senior year. I worried about the shortcuts she'd started taking, the pills that promised focus, the occasional escape valve for pressure she never showed anyone. I typed those worries into the white box and watched them turn into sentences that felt reasonable instead of dramatic. Gloria never scolded. She asked careful questions. She called my protectiveness admirable, and then, almost imperceptibly, began to steer our nights back to Lacey again and again. Like a river nudged by a new shoreline. I noticed the steering, but mistook it for care. We were kids rehearsing adulthood through paragraphs. You learn to confuse attention with affection, when attention is the currency of your nights. And once you accept attention as proof, you stop checking the bills for counterfeits. Outside the screen, life kept its ordinary shape. School, chores, the soft friction of a house where everyone is trying. My stepdad, Carl, was part of that background, decent at small talk, earnest about rules, never quite fitting the outline of the word father. If you'd asked me, then who knew me best, I would have said my mother, then Lacey, then a tie between the notebook I hid under my mattress and a girl named Gloria, who only existed after dark. Every now and then, I'd customize AIM the way you rearrange your room when you can't change anything that matters. I gave certain friends custom alerts, little audio tags that announced them. I made Gloria's alert a joke at first, a pop culture soundbite that belonged to a different kind of friendship. Over time, it became something else, a Pavlovian thread between the room where the computer lived and the place in my chest where anticipation set up camp. I didn't understand yet that conditioning can run in both directions, that a signal that once meant comfort can be rewired to mean dread. By the time the weather turned and November pressed its gray thumb against the afternoon, Gloria felt less like a new friend and more like an inevitability, a presence I would have to explain someday to the grown-up I was becoming. That's the trick of certain kinds of trust online. It doesn't arrive as a leap. It seeps. You don't notice you're ankle deep until cold creeps above your knees. And then, when the current shifts, you realize the shore moved while you were busy talking. You realize the door you built swings both ways. Gloria fit herself into my days the way a key slides into a lock you didn't realize you'd been carrying. She always appeared after 9. She said clubs ran late. Step house rules ran later. And the only time she could be herself was when the world around her settled. I believed her because the timing fit the shape of my own house. Dinner plates drying in the rack. The TV dim in the living room. Footsteps passing once in the hallway and then fading. That was when the family computer felt most like a confessional with a glowing door. She told me about the strict stepmother, a neat, almost sterile figure who measured curfews like medicine. She told me her birth mom lived far away and sent postcards that smelled faintly of a different climate. She told me her dad was gone. The details were tidy, respectful of boundaries, the way kids talk when they've learned which adult subjects draw too many follow-up questions. I didn't interrogate it. I matched her tone. I talked about teachers who circled my name on quizzes just a little too hard. The harmless friction between my mom and stepdad. The kind of day you summarize because the truth feels too ordinary to matter. Pictures made it easier to choose trust. I had 2 from her. One stiff school portrait, the other a scan of a candid where the sun cut across her cheek like a blade of clean light. In return, I sent my own awkward class photo and a cropped snapshot from a field trip where you could barely tell which kid was me if you didn't already know. She said the awkwardness read as thoughtfulness. I said the light in her candid looked like a promise. We were teenagers trying on the language of adults, praising each other with careful economy, pretending that restraint meant depth. The medium we used was its own accomplice. AAM gave you a private theater for 2. A stage where you could whisper parts of yourself you'd never risk in a crowded cafeteria. I curated away messages like talismans and set custom alerts for the people who felt closest. When Gloria came online, the icon flashed and a familiar line from an old cartoon tagged along. It started as a joke, a little signature to make us both smirk. Later, it hardened into something else, a phrase that once made me grin would eventually carry the weight of a threat. I didn't know that yet. Our nightly conversations braided themselves into routines that looked like intimacy. We played browser games that would be embarrassed to exist now. We traded thoughts on songs like we were bartering spices. She wanted to know what made me feel seen. I wanted to know what made her feel safe. She didn't overshare. She made space. When I dropped a heavier thread, she didn't tug, she waited. Then wrapped it around another question that felt gentler. The effect was disarming. The more she learned, the more I wanted to give. That was how Lacey entered the room. I didn't plan to talk about my sister. It leaked out the way the truth does when you're tired and grateful. Lacey was weeks from graduating, stretched thin by deadlines and the future, building a scaffold out of study aids and occasional shortcuts that worried me more than I admitted out loud. I typed the facts, and then the feelings I would never have told her to her face. Protectiveness can be a kind of pride. It can also be a kind of fear. Gloria listened the way a calm person holds a match without flinching. She asked measured questions. What classes were hardest? Whether Lacey slept. Whether anyone at home noticed the strain. She called my vigilance admirable. She said older siblings didn't always get someone watching their blind spots. It felt like grace. It was also a pivot. After that night, our talks found their way back to Lacey, as if a river had discovered a new bed to follow. How's she doing today? Any better sleep? You said she sometimes reaches for something to focus. What does that look like? Each question was justified by the last. A chain of care that looked too polished to argue with. I told myself it was empathy. I told myself it was friendship's version of due diligence. I did not tell myself it was a hand tracing a map of my family from the outside in. Meanwhile, Gloria's own biography became clearer in ways that did not invite scrutiny. The stepmother, devout, brittle, fond of rules for their own sake. The old neighborhood, all cul-de-sacs and lawns cut to regulation. The absent mother, a voice on the phone that felt like a holiday. The dead father, a finishing nail of a sentence that went in straight and wouldn't come back out. When I asked for specifics, she shrugged them off with the practiced grace of someone who knows which nothings sound like enough. That restraint read as maturity to me. It also left no loose threads to pull. We were both writing versions of ourselves designed to be believed. I kept my stepdad, Carl, mostly offstage because it was easier. He was decent in the way people can be decent and opaque at the same time, helpful with rides, earnest about curfews, mildly awkward with jokes that never quite landed. He was part of the furniture of our life, functional, unremarkable. If you'd asked me then who knew me best, I would have said my mother, then my sister, then, absurdly but honestly, Gloria. Because every night I chose to sit down and be seen by a person who asked just the right questions and never once made me feel foolish for answering. The first hairline crack didn't appear as doubt. It appeared as a compliment that felt slightly misaligned with what I'd told her. Something she repeated that I hadn't said out loud. A guess that landed too precisely on a detail I didn't remember typing. I dismissed it as memory. Then another small misalignment. The way she'd reference a teacher's phrasing or my mother's schedule with a confidence that suggested more than inference when I asked how she remembered so well. She laughed it off in the text message way of laughing and said she had a good head for patterns. I wanted that to be true. I let it be true. This is how trust can be taught to misread its own instincts. You mark the discomfort. You label it as your fault. You file it under stress or under school, under adolescence. And the person making you uncomfortable offers you relief from that very discomfort by acting like nothing has happened. You take the relief. You call it proof that everything is fine. I told her more. She asked, with care, for more. And on the nights when I didn't come online, the backlog of messages waiting for me was tender and patient. The written equivalent of someone leaving a light on in the window. It never read as pressure. It read as presence. It's astonishing how close those two words sit when you are 15 and lonely in ways you don't have names for. By late fall, the routine felt inevitable. The icon would flicker. The line I'd chosen long ago for a joke would tag along. The window would bloom, and I would step through it. I didn't know yet that stepping through meant leaving doors unlocked behind me. I didn't know yet that someone else had a key. All I knew was that the voice I trusted most lived inside a screen and wanted to know just a little more about the people I loved. Trust never arrives like a thunderclap. It arrives in repetitions. The same screen, the same handle, the same late hour when the rest of the house softened and I could believe I was safe inside the glow. Gloria and I built habits that felt like comfort. A check-in after homework, a trade of links and in-jokes, a running list of small victories we pretended were larger than they were. Repetition is how you teach the body to stop scanning for danger. She learned my schedule the way a neighbor learns the pattern of a porch light. She knew the day my English teacher handed back essays, the hour my mom liked to fold laundry, the sliver of time after dinner when the kitchen went quiet and I could slip away. None of this seemed ominous because it wasn't presented as surveillance. It felt like care. She remembered the test I dreaded and asked about it before I mentioned it. She noticed when my replies got shorter and told me to log off early and sleep. She framed it as permission. I took it as proof. We filled the space with games that were already dated even as we played them. Habbo Hotel, Club Penguin, little worlds where you could decorate a room or waddle through a cartoon street and pretend you were making choices that mattered. The point wasn't the game. The point was that the games let us orbit each other without having to hold eye contact. She'd notice my avatar's color or the way I arranged a digital bookshelf and draw conclusions that sounded flattering. I'd say something about a soundtrack she shared and pretend I meant more than the compliment because it felt good to be read as interesting by someone I had decided was interesting. When the conversation turned toward home, the lane kept curving back to Lacey. It always began softly. How was she sleeping? Did graduation pressure ease after midterms? Had our mom noticed the way Lacey's hands shook on bad days? None of it felt invasive, because each question grew out of a previous answer, like a branch that made sense. And I was the one who'd opened that door. If I bristled at her focus, I told myself it was because I was protective. If I welcomed it, I told myself it was because I wanted help being a better brother. Both explanations let me keep talking. I started editing my day through the filter of what Gloria might ask later, little mental notes. The time Lacey skipped dinner, the empty orange bottle left on the counter, the way my stepdad, Carl, suggested she take a break with a voice that tried to sound light. I would package these details and carry them to the screen at night, as if writing them down transformed worry into action. Gloria never scolded. She affirmed. She told me my vigilance mattered. She said families often miss what is right in front of them because love can be a soft focus lens. She positioned herself as a clean lens. I accepted the framing. Every friendship has a moment when it becomes its own world with its own weather, and you only notice the climate when you step outside and start to shiver. Mine arrived quietly. I caught myself checking for Gloria's alert phrase, like a student checks a clock. The simple line I'd chosen months earlier had become more than a joke. It was an anchor I didn't think I could float without. If the alert didn't arrive on time, I felt ridiculous anxiety creep into the spaces of my evening. Anchors are supposed to steady you. They can also keep you from swimming. There were small irregularities I wrote off as my memory. She knew the precise wording of a teacher's complaint when I'd only summarized it. She predicted the evening my mom asked me to run a quick errand and blocked out the 20 minutes I would be gone as if she'd scheduled it herself. When I asked how she remembered so well, she told me she tracked patterns the way other people track sports scores. I told myself I was lucky to know someone attentive. I did not ask why the attention felt directed through the walls of my house. The dynamic sharpened the night I told her about an argument Lacey had with our mom. The details weren't dramatic. A deadline, a missed chore, the kind of conversation that happens in any house under pressure, but I admitted I'd frozen when it escalated and said nothing. And later, I hated myself for staying quiet. Gloria didn't soothe me with platitudes. She laid out a script. If it happens again, say this. Step between them this way. Stand here. Keep your voice level. Name what you see, rather than what you think. It was eerily specific for someone who had never stepped foot in our hallway. It felt like expertise. It also felt like choreography. She began leaving me little prompts in our chat, like index cards for a test. If Lacey's hands shake, offer water. If she skips dinner, sit with her anyway and eat something small. If your stepdad weighs in, keep the conversation with your mother. The prompts were useful, even wise. They also implied a presence in our kitchen, that only existed at my screen. I told myself wisdom can arrive from anywhere. I told myself that the distance made her impartial. What I didn't tell myself was that impartiality without context can still become control when it is applied nightly to a family that hasn't asked for an advisor. The love bombing, if that's what it was, never used the word love. It used admiration. It used gratitude. She told me I restored her faith that people our age could be decent. She said I listened differently, that I didn't posture the way boys online so often did. She said Lacey was lucky to have me. She said my mom had probably forgotten what it felt like to be helped. Compliments like these arrive as blankets. You don't notice the weight until you try to stand. I wanted to be the person she described, so I kept acting like him for her. When I stepped back, on the nights I tried to, I noticed how little I actually knew about Gloria compared to how much she knew about me. I could have described her stepmother's rules and the vague geography of her neighborhood, but I couldn't have drawn a map to her front door. I had 2 photos and 1,000 lines of text that added up to a voice. The voice felt consistent, careful, generous. Consistency does a lot of heavy lifting when you're building belief out of invisibility. By mid-November, the air outside had that cold clarity that makes everything look sharper. Inside, the room with the computer felt warmer than the rest of the house. That's where I sat one night, typing about a new flare of stress around Lacey's finals, when the tone of our conversation shifted by a degree so small I wouldn't name it until later. Gloria stopped asking about Lacey and started asking about the future. Mine, not hers. Where I wanted to live. What kind of partner I imagined being. Whether I thought friendship could be the purest form of care, or if it was always a preface to something else. I tried to answer as if the questions were philosophical. I wrote paragraphs that sounded older than I was. She responded with a string of messages that read like a path laid across a river. Each one invited the next step. It felt like a harmless thought experiment. It was, in fact, a crossing. By the end of that week, the questions narrowed. She asked what I feared most, being alone or being misunderstood. She asked what I thought about honesty that hurts versus kindness that hides. She asked whether I believed you could know a person better through words than through a room. And then she asked the question that made the rest inevitable. Have you ever considered that what we have is already more than most people get? And maybe we should stop pretending it isn't? I didn't answer that night. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I was protecting the friendship. The truth was simpler. I felt the ground tilt under me, and I braced, hoping the angle would correct itself if I stayed very still. The question Gloria left hanging between us wasn't answered the next day either. She didn't push. And that, more than anything, made me want to respond. Restraint from her was rare, But when she finally came back around, she didn't revisit the topic directly. Instead, she asked if I thought some things were easier to say in person. It was a trap disguised as an olive branch. I told myself she was trying to protect the friendship from the awkwardness of my hesitation. She told me she thought maybe it was time for us to meet. Not in a dreamy, someday way, but now. The suggestion carried an inevitability I hadn't seen coming, though it had been engineered from the start. I agreed before I let my common sense have its say. We chose a park near my house, public enough to feel safe, empty enough to feel private, at least. That was her framing. The timing landed at that dusky in-between hour when the world looks washed in silver and streetlights haven't yet decided to turn on. I got there early, sitting on the worn bench. I rehearsed scenarios in my head. She's a shy classmate who never said her name. She's older than she claimed, but just lonely. She's not who I pictured, but still, my friend. The car rolled in slow, windows down, music blaring. Thy Unveiling by Insane Clown Posse, a song I hadn't listened to in years, but had once loved with embarrassing intensity. That detail landed like a pebble in my stomach. Then the rest of it landed. The car was familiar. The driver was familiar. Carl, my stepdad. He stepped out like it was an after-school pickup, not an ambush. His face was wearing an expression halfway between smug and sheepish. In the seconds it took him to cross the distance, my brain tried and failed to produce a version of reality where this wasn't what it looked like. It was exactly what it looked like. Carl was Gloria. At first, I thought maybe he'd intercepted our meeting to scare me straight about stranger danger, but he started talking, recounting every conversation, every inside joke, every fragment I had only ever given to her, and the truth arranged itself without my help. He hadn't been reading over my shoulder. He had been on the other end of the line the entire time. I felt the betrayal in layers, losing a friend, discovering she'd never existed, realizing my stepdad had been pretending to be a 15-year-old girl for months. Then came the part that broke through my shock. Carl reminding me that Gloria had confessed to loving me. I asked him why. He looked down, color rising in his face. And when he looked back up, the shift was terrifying. The soft, mostly harmless man my mom married was gone. In his place was someone who grabbed me by the collar, dragged me close, and hissed a threat so specific it froze my lungs. If I told anyone, he'd ruin Lacey's life. He didn't have to explain how. I'd told Gloria everything, and Gloria had written it all down. I wish I could say the truth ended it. It didn't. It built a new cage. Carl drove me home as if this were an ordinary ride after practice. The same route, the same turns, the same porch light waiting. inside. He lowered his voice into something nearly gentle and laid out the rules as if we were negotiating chores. I would keep talking to Gloria. I would answer as if nothing had changed. I would protect Lacey by protecting his secret. He didn't shout. He didn't pace. He didn't need to. The threat had already been delivered in the parking lot, and it lived inside my chest now. Do not tell. Keep the peace. Pretend. Those weren't requests. They were commands he installed like software. Embedded in each was a consequence that didn't need spelling out. So I logged back in. The screen bloomed to life. And there she was, Gloria, typing with the same cadence, using the same phrases that used to feel like comfort. I answered, because not answering felt like handing Lacey over. He made it easy to comply every so often. Gloria would drop a line no stranger could know. See you at dinner. Or a reference to a comment he'd made in person. The slips weren't accidents. They were signatures. The strangest part was how quickly my mind split to survive. I could feel the disgust and the fear and still perform the role. The way an actor can fall apart backstage and walk out smiling under the lights. I learned to manage time. 15 minutes of chat. Then a break to breathe. Answer 2 questions. Then pivot to a safe topic. Name my discomfort out loud to myself in a sentence. Then return to the script. It was a trance loop of my own design. Count the keystrokes. Regulate the breath. Make the sentences short. He pushed boundaries by degrees. Praise turned warmer. Advice grew more possessive. The questions shifted from how my day had gone to how my body felt carrying the day. When I ignored an escalation, the next night he returned to normal, as if to prove I had imagined the line, that rhythm. Advance, retreat, reward, teaches you to doubt your own map. I started annotating our conversations in a notebook I hid beneath a loose floorboard. Dates, times, lines that changed temperature mid-sentence. The strange way he rewrote my memories in his answers. How he remembered events I'd only hinted at. How he cited phrasing I hadn't used on the screen. I told myself I was documenting in case I ever needed proof. The truth was smaller and more immediate. Writing in pen felt like reclaiming 1 inch of ground from a man who had taken the rest. There's a point where fear stops feeling protective and starts feeling like consent. That was my line. It arrived on a weeknight in early winter when everything outside the window had the color of metal. Gloria asked a question that carried me somewhere I would not go. I closed the chat without answering. Then I sat very still, because stillness felt like the only thing I owned. Lacey found me at the kitchen table with that notebook. She sat, waited, and let me decide. The words came out the way a door finally gives, all at once. all the hinges tearing at the same time. I told her everything. AIM, the late nights, the parking lot, the commands dressed up as kindness, the leverage he claimed to have over her. I expected fury. I expected her to tell me I had destroyed something that mattered. She was calm. She said the part that he used to control me didn't hold. The shortcuts had been brief. She had stopped. There was nothing to expose. And then she did what no one had done for me in months. She handed the problem back to its source. "We are not the secret," she said. "He is." That sentence cut the loop. Once spoken, it made the next steps obvious. We didn't wait for a perfect plan. We waited for an empty house. When our mom's car pulled away for a grocery run, and Carl left for an errand he'd announced too loudly. We moved, Lacey at the family computer, me at his desk machine. We didn't guess his password. We remembered our mother's birthday. The desktop was a ruin of folders, named with the arrogance of someone who thinks naming is camouflage. Budget, church, music. Inside were transcripts, not just ours, threads with other boys, mapped across months, sometimes years. The same pattern repeated with different names. Late night windows. You can tell me. You are safe here. Praise that narrowed into control, and in one thread, an instruction to buy a digital camera with allowance money. We printed until the tray hit empty. We filled a binder because a binder felt like a fact even when you were shaking. We put the pages in order and hid them beneath the linen in Lacey's closet. We didn't confront him. We didn't call him. We waited for our mother because safety wasn't going to come from a performance of bravery. It was going to come from telling the person who could change the locks. Secrets rot a house from the inside. Sunlight isn't gentle, but it is medicine. We gave our mother the binder at the table where we'd eaten hundreds of quiet meals. She read the first pages and tried to keep reading without letting her hands shake. Then she stopped pretending composure helped. She called a number she had kept for emergencies she prayed would never arrive. She told us to stay in the living room and not to open the door for anyone. The rest didn't play like a movie. There were calls, follow-ups, questions phrased carefully by people who have to care about procedure. There were statements to write and signatures to practice. There was the slow, measured way adults make room for a thing that violates their sense of the world. They set the kettle on. They bring out a stack of forms. They speak in calm tones so the shape of the day doesn't collapse. Carl didn't rage when he understood what we had done. He tried a different script, the one that paints shame as illness, control as loneliness, predation as a mistake made by a hurting man. Our mother didn't accept the script. She told him to leave. He left. The door closed behind him with a sound I'd been holding my breath for without knowing it. Law enforcement became a new vocabulary. Some things they could pursue. Some things the era couldn't name clearly enough to prosecute. What they could do, they did. What they couldn't do, they documented. Our mother did the rest. The practical heroism of guardianship, changing passwords, placing calls to other households that needed to know, moving the computer into a room where no one could disappear behind a door. Gloria went silent because there had never been a girl to go quiet. The alert sound I had trained myself to crave became an artifact overnight, like a song from a summer that had ended. I deleted the profile and felt nothing for 2 minutes. Then I felt everything at once and had to sit on the floor to keep from falling. Survival isn't a single act. It's a calendar you keep turning. The months after were not cinematic redemption. They were appointments, new routines, conversations that reknitted our house into something that could hold weight again. My mother began narrating small movements, where she kept the mail, which accounts she had changed, when she'd be home. That narration wasn't control. It was an offering, a way to say, you no longer have to infer, you get to know. Lacey learned the art of ordinary rest. She ate with us because eating alone had been how stress convinced her she didn't need care. She graduated. She handed me a brochure for a college an hour away and said I would visit when I wanted, and not because we were guarding each other anymore. That distinction mattered. It turned proximity back into choice. I stayed vigilant in a way that wasn't healthy and didn't feel optional. I searched Carl's name online every few months, then every year. I told myself I was only checking to be sure he hadn't resurfaced anywhere near children. The truth was that I was also monitoring the monster in my story to prove to myself he stayed in the past tense. There were no new incidents I could find. Eventually, there was an obituary, small and unadorned, from the middle of the last decade. Alone. Illness. End of file. The relief I felt tasted complicated. The binder lived in a locked drawer until the day my mother asked whether we could shred it. We didn't. We moved it to a box labeled House Papers, because that's what it had become. A document of what we survived, and the proof that naming a thing gives you power over it. You can't build a future out of denial. You can build one out of records and light. If you're young and reading this, let me interrupt the story to plant a command in your head. Tell someone. The internet is better now at showing you who you're talking to. It is also better at helping people lie. Verification helps. Vigilance matters more. If anyone asks for secrecy, call it what it is, a leash. If anyone uses what you shared in trust to force you to share more, call it what it is, a weapon. If your body reads danger while your brain composes excuses, trust the body and step away. I am not the kid at the family computer anymore. I am the adult who sits with his wife at night and says out loud the things I once only typed to a stranger. When the familiar echo of that old alert sound shows up in a sitcom or a meme, my chest still tightens for a second. Then I breathe and remind myself that the door is shut. The locks were changed. The house is ours. This story does not end with a perfect sentence, because life rarely hands those out. It ends with a practice. I tell the truth, and the truth makes a space no secret can survive in. If any part of this feels like your life, borrow that practice. Speak. Write. Hand someone the binder if you have one. Let sunlight do its work. You are not the secret. The person hiding behind the screen is. I used to think routine could keep a person safe. Wake up, black coffee, job boards, gym, Starbucks, repeat. When money thinned out and the city felt like it had been wrapped in plastic, routine felt like the last thread keeping me from unraveling. So when a stranger used my own routine to step inside my life, it felt less like a coincidence and more like a lock turning from the outside. I don't share the city because I still live here. It's large enough to swallow headlines and small enough that the barista remembers your order, even through a mask. In 2020, I was furloughed. Then, watched the stimulus shrink in my checking account like water boiling away. I'd just left a relationship because lockdown turned my apartment into a lecture hall I never signed up for. The man I'd loved started quoting self-help manifestos like they were scripture, and I recognized the slope he was sliding down. I blocked him and told myself that choosing quiet was not the same as giving up. Money disagreed. Each morning, I tried to beat the sun to the kitchen. I would drink coffee without cream. Clean. Punishing. And sit in the high-backed chair that made me feel like a responsible adult. Job boards first. Then the ones that were just job boards, pretending to be job boards. I'd chase remote listings that promised benefits after 90 days. Code for benefits. Never. When the search returned the usual confetti of rejections, I went to one of the few gyms still open. Lifting steadied me. Sets and reps were a kind of contract. Break a sweat. Get a result. Control lived in immeasurable numbers. Control lived in the way a bar felt when I pulled it from the rack, and in how the steel cooled as I set it down. Control didn't live in my inbox. On the day everything pivoted, a message reached me before the crossword could. It wore a friendly voice and flexible hours and daily earnings up to $1,000, like a glittering lure drifting right in front of a hungry fish. Even half awake, I recognized the structure. A multi-level marketing pitch with flattery baked into the first sentence. I blocked and reported it. The small satisfaction of doing the right thing lasted about a breath. At the gym, a new face appeared in the mirror behind the rows of ellipticals. She could have been any woman in this city. Mid-30s, sharp cheeks, a mouth shaped by filler, Eyeliner, so precise, it made me wonder how long she'd stood in front of a bathroom bulb. She didn't lift, didn't stretch. She stayed on her phone, angling her body by tiny degrees as if she were finessing an invisible audience. I clocked her and filed her under someone else's problem. I put plates on a bar and let the weight press focus into me until the anxious fuzziness around the edges of the morning receded. After a shower, I swapped into a strappy top and leggings, the uniform of a person trying to feel put together on a budget, and walked to the Starbucks a block away. I ordered the drink I pretend is a treat because it costs more than it should. Then took the corner table I love because it faces the window and lets me pretend time is a river that I'm not drowning in. My phone lit with more pitches, different accounts, same language. If you've spent time online, you know the phrasing. Uncanny empathy in the first line, an invitation in the second, a deadline in the third. 5 accounts, maybe more. Every profile used the same photo, that same woman with the careful eye makeup. It was so lazy, it would have been funny if I hadn't already seen her in a mirror an hour earlier. Anchors are supposed to keep you steady. Sometimes they tell you where the storm is. The distance between a message and a body is supposed to be the size of the internet. It turns out the distance is 3 tables. I looked up from my phone and found the same face in real space, 3 tables away, facing me without quite facing me, raising a cup to her mouth in little pauses that gave her time to observe. It wasn't a hallucination brought on by caffeine and frustration. It was the profile picture with bone and skin around it. Lip color matched, eyeliner matched, even the slack. Vaguely amused expression matched, as if she'd captured herself in a mirror so many times that her features returned to the same coordinates on command. My brain did the work it always does. Explain. Maybe she's a fan of the same influencer. Maybe the photo circulates in some cosmetics group. Maybe the algorithm hoisted her up in 5 places at once. An easier thought followed. And I didn't like it. She knows your name. The baristas call it. People repeat it. You hand your personal details to strangers for a foam crown on a cup. I searched the brand name in the pitch. Nothing. Not bad SEO, not poor ranking. Nothing. A company that claims to pay out daily should leave a footprint. This one left clean snow. Meanwhile, the messages kept multiplying like reflections in a mirrored changing room. New profiles, same image, copy tweaked by a bored hand. You don't get that kind of volume without time. You don't get that kind of time without obsession. A more disturbing puzzle piece slid into view. Research. I didn't know this then, but later my friends would confess their inboxes had been touched too. Innocent probes asking what they liked about me, where I worked, what I ate when I was stressed, whether I was the kind of friend who canceled plans at the time. All I had was a throb starting at the base of my skull, and a sense that my private routine had become public theater. I gathered my cup, stood, and decided to leave before my fear could find a shape. She stood at the same time. I told myself I was imagining the synchronicity. I paused to toss a napkin. She paused to sip. The air outside didn't feel like air. It felt like a hallway between two rooms where you aren't supposed to be seen. On the sidewalk, she closed the distance like a person who has rehearsed the moment. She didn't run. She floated on a certainty that I would stop when she wanted me to. And when I didn't, she spoke a name. My name. She said it as if she owned the syllables. I turned, because your body will always turn when it hears itself called. And I found myself looking at a face I already recognized too well. "What are you doing?" I asked. The words came out steady because I needed them to. Her answer took a path I didn't expect. It wasn't about entrepreneurship or freedom or the dignity of being your own boss. It wasn't even about makeup. She talked about a man. According to her, he belonged to her first, and I had taken him. She made the accusation with the authority of a court clerk reading a file I hadn't seen. This would have been almost comic, if not for the way she watched me, as if any twitch in my face could be a confession. Memory tried to drag in a chair between us. A man I had dated months earlier, long enough ago that pandemic time had folded it into a flat page, had not mentioned a partner. He'd turned out to be hollow in the places that mattered, so I cut him loose. The next week, I saw him with someone else, and felt nothing except relief that he had found a place to land that wasn't my living room. "I didn't take anything from you," I said. "He didn't tell me you existed." She received this not as information, but as an obstacle to climb over. I heard the kind of insistence that isn't about facts. It's about writing a narrative, and then making the world obey it. She stepped closer. I stepped back and found that my heel touched the curb. The decision presented itself. Stand and argue with a stranger, building a case in her head, or relocate the stage. When fear looks like a person, movement is a kind of language. Say less. Move more. You learn quickly that you can't win a debate you did not sign up to have. You can, however, choose the terrain. I turned and walked, not fast, not slow, just enough to communicate that I had somewhere to be that wasn't here. She matched my cadence as if she could access my pace. When I cut right, she cut right. When I paused at a crosswalk, she did too, but at an angle that kept me within her sightline. Her presence was loud, without making a sound. The city around us performed its usual acts. Delivery trucks easing toward curbs, masked faces gliding past, a man balancing a tray of coffees with the careful focus of someone who cannot afford a spill. I tried to fold myself into that anonymity. The trick with unwanted attention is to pretend you don't see it, if you stage it correctly. Sometimes it gets bored and wanders off. This attention did not wander. I turned questions over in my head, looking for one that could shrink her back down into the screen where she belonged. Had she used my gym check-ins to find me? My drink order to learn my name? My friend's habitual kindness to open doors? I thought of my ex and felt not anger, not even frustration, just a kind of antiseptic clarity. He had left a trail of careless introductions behind him, and a woman had followed it until she reached me. "Why are you following me?" I said finally. "Because you know what you did," she replied. "You can either admit it or keep pretending." There is a special fatigue that comes from being forced to play both defendant and court reporter in a trial where the verdict is pre-written. I did the math on my options and found them wanting. I could perform being conciliatory and hope she needed the performance more than the person. I could stop and escalate, or I could choose a place where strangers and cameras would bear witness if she decided to do more than hover. The entrance to the subway yawned open a block ahead, a tilted rectangle leading to a kind of underworld I knew well. I made a decision. My mother would call foolish, and my younger self would call inevitable. I took the stairs. She followed. Of course she followed. The air thickened with that particular underground scent. Metal, old water, a trace of bleach from the era when we all believed we could scrub our way back to normal. Commuters arranged themselves by habit along the platform, those who stand near the stairs to be first up, those who walk to the ends for a seat, those who face the wall as if concentration could build a barrier. I chose the spot between two columns, the limbo zone where you can still reposition before the train arrives. She hovered at a distance I could measure with my breath, close enough to let me know I was being catalogued, far enough to keep an argument were I to accuse her of anything. I checked the digital board, counting down minutes like a runner waiting for a gun. A train emerged and pulled into place with the hydraulics of a sleeping beast. Doors opened. People flowed. I moved with them, and so did she. Sometimes survival looks like a choice you made years earlier. In my case, it was a teenage body that learned how to move fast when it needed to. I did not want a confrontation. I wanted an exit. Exits are their own kind of violence when someone believes you owe them your attention. I made a calculation that required nerve and a little luck. The turnstiles were crowded, and the card readers were temperamental. I slipped through the space where the gate hadn't swung back to neutral, the way agile city kids do without thinking, and reached the stairs as a conductor announced that the train was already late and would depart promptly. Behind me, my pursuer hesitated at the bottleneck of people still paying. An advantage down on the platform. I threaded through a cluster of riders and targeted the rear door of the last car. Crowded carriages challenge anyone who wants control. There's no room to posture when you're boxed in by strangers' elbows and tote bags. I knew that if she made it inside, she'd be enclosed with me and forced to negotiate in whispers and glares. I banked on that pressure, diluting her script. The doors began to slide. She slipped through at the last second, satisfaction glimmering at the corners of her mouth. For a moment, we stood in the same cell of air. The car smelled like rain, caught in coats, and the artificial citrus of hand sanitizer. She stared at me with an intensity that had no volume and no shame. In that confined space, her certainty felt heavier. She believed she had cornered me. I pivoted away, pressing into the slow current of bodies toward the opposite door. I stepped off at the next station before the crowd had fully reorganized, slipped along the platform, and let the train take her deeper into a tunnel I didn't feel like entering, back above ground. The light felt foreign, as if the city had been replaced while I was 2 stories down. I walked until the cadence of my steps returned to something like normal, until I could raise a hand for a cab without broadcasting panic. The driver asked where to, and I gave an address that wasn't my home, but would get me within walking distance. I used to think that was paranoia. It turned out to be prudence. In the back seat, I watched the city move past with the flatness of a slideshow. Bodegas lit like tiny stages, plywood murals that had bloomed during the shutdown, a couple arguing with the careful choreography of people who live together and can't afford to break up. I felt the shake of adrenaline recede the way a tide goes out, leaving behind damp evidence that it had ever been there. Control felt like a lie again, but a useful one. I repeated the lie until it held my weight. Safety is not a destination. It's a practice you repeat, even when you resent what it costs. That night, I did something I should have done months earlier. I deleted names from social platforms until I could barely recognize my own reflection online. I retired old usernames and stripped my profiles to the kind of minimal presence that looks like abandonment. I edited privacy settings until they felt like armor. If you can work out who I am from this, you won't find a public door to knock on, friends admitted, with the mixture of shame and relief that comes with delayed honesty. That she had messaged them with practiced casualness. Questions that sounded like curiosity about me were really reconnaissance. I understood then how much time she had devoted to building a scaffold around a stranger she believed had wronged her. I filed for protective orders. One judge granted, another tightened. Paper alone doesn't keep a person away. And I know that. It buys you a margin to call the police with more than a story. It puts your fear in a database so that when you speak it, it isn't the first time the words appear in a system. I stopped taking selfies that showed my street or my windows. I said no to tags. I learned to love the freedom of being vaguely present. A friend tells me often that I should move. Maybe she's right. There is a particular bitterness in maintaining a folder labeled with your own name and the word stalker, screenshots, dates, descriptions, the way a body moved near a door, the way a message recycled language from last month, evidence that adds up to a picture of obsession that would have looked dramatic if I hadn't lived it. Sometimes I open the folder and add a line just to acknowledge the work of being my own archivist. The last time I saw her was in reflection, glass catching a figure that might have been anyone. Maybe she has help now. Maybe she found another script to occupy her hands. Obsession doesn't evaporate because you stopped reading it. It migrates to the next person who fits the template. I'm writing this to place a marker. If she escalates, a trail exists that doesn't rely on my memory alone. And if nothing happens, then this is just a record of a year when so much collapsed that even the line between online and real life didn't hold. People keep talking about a return to normal, but I don't know anyone whose definition survived. If routine is a thread, then this is me knotting it. Not because I believe knots are unbreakable, but because the hands that tie them belong to me. I'm from Old Blighty. Yes, but the only time I ever sound like a caricature is when someone tries to turn me into one. That's how the first message landed. A bright, sugar-coated parody of Britain from a Californian who called herself Handcuffs. She wrote like a postcard and flirted like a dare. She had found my MySpace, said my grainy street photos felt cinematic, said my profile song made her think London was a slow heartbeat under rain. She kept tossing me mock Victorian greetings, old chap, tally-ho, and the rest. And I played along, because it felt easier to be a stereotype when someone attractive asked for it. Her avatar looked like a polished secret, sleeve tattoos and black fringe, mouth set with practiced defiance, a frame of light that made her look like an argument you want to lose. Her page looked like the sort of page lads used to pass around in a sixth form computer lab, with the volume down and the blinds angled. She said she worked for a modeling site I'm not supposed to name, the one everyone pretends not to know, but mysteriously knows. The one that brands alt girls with ink and fringe and a practiced feral stare. She sent public shots first, all studio polish and curated attitude. Then came a second batch that looked like they belonged to a members-only gallery. Angles too intimate for the open web. Lighting that suggested paywalls and premium tiers. I did not ask how she had them. I did not ask anything that would make the fantasy blink. Handcuffs fed the story with details that felt private. A candid from a kitchen I'd never see. A mirror selfie where the edge of the frame caught a stack of worn paperbacks I also owned. A note about British chocolate being better because of the fat content. Nothing outrageous. Everything designed to breathe close to the ear. She made my flat sound mysterious. My bus route romantic. My accent charming rather than ordinary. She told me she loved that my photos made cracked pavements look deliberate, like the city had been stitched on purpose. She turned my most average details into a kind of curated myth. Weeks blurred. We spoke in DMs, then in longer emails when she said the site had moderators who didn't always behave. She wrote late. Pacific evenings that reached me in British dawn. I'd wake to paragraphs poured in the narrow hours, music lists, confessions about bad haircuts, stories about the strangest photo shoot she had ever done. That intimacy felt earned. It wasn't. It was a funnel disguised as friendship. The more she knew, the more angles she could present back to me, polished and flattering. She asked about my friends, and then remembered their names. She learned my street, and then praised the way the morning light fell through my blinds, as if she had been there to see it. Somewhere between praise and echo, she moved the story forward. She told me she was falling for me. She wrote it without garnish, no emojis, no nervous hedging, just a clear sentence, as if she'd measured it with a spirit level. The word love looked absurd between us, and also, somehow, inevitable. I tried to slow it by calling it a crush, by saying we were both projecting, by reminding her that I was a stranger with a national insurance number and a bus pass, not a fantasy that could be packed into a suitcase. She responded the way a narrator responds when a character goes off script. She raised the stakes. The plan is California. She would fly me out. It would be secret at first, then funny, then a story we told at a wedding where the best man mocked the exchange rate and everyone pretended not to know which site had paid her rent. She spoke about the Pacific, as if it were a duvet she intended to drag over my shoulders. She said I would photograph her at sunrise on a cold beach, and the light would treat us kindly. She did not ask me whether I wanted any of that. She narrated it as if I'd already said yes. Then came the hinge on which every false romance seems to swing. The clever problem only you can solve. The bank, hers, American, temperamental, couldn't purchase UK origin tickets in pounds, she said. The exchange filters were a nightmare. The fees were cruel. If I purchased my own ticket in pounds, she could reimburse me in dollars, and Lloyd's would glide the money between currencies without bruising a single digit. She told me this with a confidence that made absurdity sound like policy. I pictured a polite clerk at a branch nodding along, stamping a form that didn't exist. But necessity is not the same as truth. Something in me shuffled awake. I asked her to send the money first, because I was skint after paying a mechanic to coax a little joy out of a tired Peugeot. She said, "Fine. Of course." She was transferring now. International wires move slowly. I should go ahead so that the ticket price didn't jump. I waited. The money did not arrive. Her tone changed, as if someone had swapped the page on a teleprompter. She said I was testing her. She said love required risk. She suggested that I must not be the kind of man who got on planes for women who believed in him. I did not take the risk. She accused me of not wanting her, which was true enough, and also beside the point. I thought I wanted her, but what I wanted more was for my rent to clear. I asked for a receipt for the supposed ticket she had now claimed she could buy after all. She said the airport would hold it for me. I asked for an email confirmation. She wrote like a tapped glass finally cracking. The compliments vanished. The parody British jokes hardened into insults about my teeth and my country and my caution. She told me to enjoy my small life. I told her to enjoy hers somewhere I wasn't paying for. I blocked her. Blocking someone on the internet feels like slamming a door without leaving the room. The silence afterwards is dishonest. You can still feel them on the other side of it. For a week, I walked around with my shoulders lifted. Every time my phone vibrated, I expected her to be back in a new account, a new costume, a fresh voice, insisting she had just fixed the bank problem, and wasn't I ready yet to become a better version of myself. She did not come back. Something worse did. It was a mild afternoon when the past crossed the street, wearing black wool and certainty. I was with two mates, discussing nothing that mattered, when my name tore across the high street with enough fury to make people pause. Lucy. Year 8. Lucy, the quiet girl who had once taken my hand under a science bench, and then, weeks later, let it go, because we did not know how to be anything but awkward. She had grown into her voice and her opinions, and a wardrobe that insisted she be seen. Pentagrams flashed against a heavy bag, eyeliner drawn like a declaration, boots that sounded like decisions. She closed the distance and tapped my sternum with a finger that felt accusatory purely by temperature. Words spilled. Blame first, then a ledger. What I owed her for a breakup so old it had grown moss. What I had denied her. What she had become without me. It would have been teenage theater if not for the details slid in between the generalities. The exchange rate, the make of my car, the way I photographed rain. A joke about British chocolate and fat content. A line I had written at 3 a.m. in a message I thought was private. I felt the shape of the scam click into place with the quiet of a door finally closing. My mates looked from her to me and back again, waiting for a version of events that ended with laughter. There was none. Lucy spoke about spells and curses because she knew I would roll my eyes, and while I did, she scanned my face for guilt. She told me she could forgive everything if I just helped with rent this one time, the way I had promised in a message I had never written to her, only to a costume she had stitched around herself and named handcuffs. I asked what? Exactly. Required forgiveness. She said, year 8, 5 years earlier. A break that was more drift than fracture. I said the quiet thing out loud. We had barely dated. The sentence landed like a thrown glass. Something behind her eyes shifted. The performance cracked, and a different person stepped forward. One I recognized from the tone she had used as handcuffs when she realized I was not going to buy a ticket to California on faith. There is nothing so dangerous as clarity in the wrong throat. The first shove took me by surprise. The second stole the pavement from beneath my feet. Granite caught the back of my head with perfect indifference. For a moment, the world narrowed to the taste of iron and the carefully painted night sky Lucy wore around her eyes. Sharp, rapid bites bloomed across my chest, pinpricks at first, then a pattern. It took a sluggish second to understand she was driving a safety pin into me over and over, with the manic precision of someone threading a needle in a storm. I reached for her wrist and found only the echo of it. Then my friends were there. The sweet, stupid bravery of boys who believe the story ends when you drag the villain away. Hands gripped my shoulders and the back of my jacket, and the world grew edges again. Lucy fought without rhythm. It wasn't theatrical now. It was a private choreography she'd been practicing alone. The safety pin slipped from her grasp and disappeared beneath a passerby's step. I said her name, and the sound of it seemed to age her by years. The fury sagged, the certainty drained from her posture, and she became, suddenly, heartbreakingly small. I do not remember the ambulance. I do not remember the ride. I remember the hospital light, because hospital light is designed to make nothing look dramatic. Even when blood dries in a halo behind your head. Concussion fog makes time into a stack of damp pages. You can turn them, but they cling. The scans showed a bleed, not catastrophic, but persuasive enough to pin me to a bed and forbid me from pretending I was fine. A nurse cleaned the constellation on my chest, where the pin had mapped its frantic route, counted each mark like a teacher taking attendance, while I waited for the ache to settle into something I could catalog. My parents arrived with faces you keep for the day. Your child makes you remember. You cannot protect them from stories that began before they were born. Behind them, Lucy's parents hovered like ghosts who had rehearsed an apology on the drive over and now could not find the first line. Lucy had dissolved into remorse. They said she had fallen hard into drink and chemicals this year, they said, and my name becoming a target was a symptom, not a thesis. They asked whether I would press charges. Their voices tried to sound practical and landed on pleading. Here is the part that internet strangers will disagree with. I did not. I should have. I know every argument. I also know that not every story heals by adding court dates to trauma. What I wanted most, in that exact moment, with lossy vision and the smell of bleach in my nose, was for this to be the last chapter, not the beginning of a tribunal. Sometimes mercy is selfish. Sometimes it is strategic. Sometimes it is both. Lucy stepped into rehab and, for once, followed a script that did not ask anyone else to fix her years later. She would be a different person in a different body with a different laugh, teaching lunges to mothers who wanted to remember what their legs were for. I did not forget what she had done. I also did not calcify around it. We see each other occasionally at reunions that feel like carefully curated exhibitions of who we might have been. Her humor is barbed and aimed almost always at herself. She has learned to look directly at the ruin she left in other people and say it out loud. That is not redemption, but it is a map. As for handcuffs, she lived on only in the grids of a chat archive and the edges of photos that were never hers. I went back and read those messages with the kind of anthropological curiosity you reserve for your most gullible self. The scaffolding was visible now. First, build affinity through flattery calibrated to the subject's exact insecurities. Second, paint the near future in a color the subject has always wanted to wear. Third, introduce a puzzle that requires the subject's wallet to solve. None of it was new. All of it had been tailored with care. There are things I wish I could unsee. The receipt I never got. The half-hearted attempt to make an airport into a will call window for a life I hadn't asked for. The sudden reroute from warmth to vitriol the moment I asked for proof. The weird, devotional way Lucy had studied my photos so that she could reflect them back to me through a different voice and harvest the glow. I learned a practical lesson about never mistaking recognition for revelation. I learned a softer one about loneliness. It will dress up as intimacy if you let it. I still take pictures in rain. I still like British chocolate more than I should. I still answer to my name when someone shouts it across a busy street. I just make sure I can step sideways before I turn. When people online ask how to avoid catfish, I don't give them algorithms. I give them a sentence. If a stranger describes you better than you can describe yourself, step away until your vision adjusts. That and keep your money where your sense lives. When I wrote this, I sent it first to Lucy. She read it with the same brutal grace she brings to everything now. She added details I had flinched away from, corrected the number of pinpricks, reminded me which book spines were visible at the edge of her mirror, selfie, when she was being someone else. She told me to send it to a true scary stories channel, because sometimes the best apology is a warning issued loudly enough that someone else hears it in time. She signed her message with a joke about British stereotypes that I will not repeat. It made me laugh anyway. If you need a final image to hold on to, hold this. A boy with a bandaged scalp, walking home slow under a sky that keeps trying to apologize for being so beautiful while everything hurts. He passes a shop window and sees his reflection, and for a flicker, expects to find the version of himself handcuffs narrated, cooler, taller, a myth with a passport. He does not. He finds a tired lad with blood dried where hair meets skin, and a map of fading crescents across his chest. He decides that is enough. He decides this is a life, not a cautionary tale. Years later, when someone messages me with a perfectly tuned compliment that clicks into a private fear like a key into a lock, I feel my scalp remember the bench. That is the anchor I keep. Not bitterness, not paranoia, just the cool, flat certainty of stone that did not care who I was. I do not need it to care. I need it to remind me. I am not a story someone else gets to write. I am not a problem that can only be solved with cash. If there is a wedding speech at the end of all of this, it will not mock the exchange rate. It will thank the part of me that finally learned to count. Lucy and I are not friends. We are something stranger. Two people who once stood on either side of an invented woman and tore pieces off ourselves to keep her alive. We have both stopped doing that now. She tells her clients to breathe through the burn and drink water. I tell anyone who will listen that flattery is not love, that privacy is not prudishness, that romance without receipts is a con dressed in lace. None of this will stop the next person from making the next mistake. But sometimes a warning arrives early enough to become a different ending. I am trying to send this one early. You can laugh at someone else's mistake until the echo circles back and you realize you're hearing your own voice. I used to be that person in the comments, the one throwing stones at strangers' stories, like it was a sport. I'd tune into live streams and type out smug little lines about how people had to be desperate or foolish to let a creep get that close online. Then 8 years ago happened, and the stone bounced. It landed right at my feet with my name on it. Allison warned me first. She always did. Sean, she wrote. There's a guy in this Facebook group who gets weird fast. He keeps bringing up swords, horror, and that edgelord culture, like it's a badge. He mentioned you. She said his name was Jeff. She said he was trying to find a way into my inbox. He did. And I, bored, a little proud of my ability to handle people, opened the door and stepped aside like a host who wanted to prove a point about hospitality. Jeff presented himself as serious, discerning, principled, the type of fan who hates anything popular on principle and calls it taste. He loved the Killing Joke and Sin City. He introduced Firefly like it was scripture and rolled his eyes at the entire MCU as if contempt made him taller. He said, real fans get their canon from Nolan, then looked pleased with himself for knowing the word canon. It wasn't all unbearable at first. He was surprisingly coherent. He could list the right names, lob the right takes, nod at the right scenes. Surface fluency is a dangerous solvent. It loosens the threads between your instincts and your patience. I like to think I'm good at catching frauds. The cracks in Jeff's persona didn't appear as confessions. They showed up as certainty. He said Batman's rogues were realistic, grounded. Nothing weird or comic booky. I laughed and told him to open literally any decade of the comics. He got angry, too angry for a disagreement about a fictional clown. He told me the comics didn't count. He told me films were the only canon because they reach more people. He used the word objective a lot, like a talisman, anchoring. That's what I call what happened next. Jeff started dropping monologues about connection, legacy, meaning, and then he turned those monologues into ladders. We don't choose the people who matter to us, he wrote one night. We recognize them. He recognized me after a week. My chat windows filled with paragraphs about what I meant to him, how rare I was, how grateful he felt. I tried to reframe. I said, carefully, that I wasn't looking for anything heavy. He kept hearing what he wanted to hear, and then congratulating me for saying it. One night, he performed chivalry like a stage trick. He bragged that he had to break the heart of his last girlfriend because she pushed for intimacy, and he had to be the moral one. When I asked what moral meant to him, he confessed the girl was 16. He was 30-something. He wore that like virtue. He had refused. She was the temptress. I read the sentence 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. That was when the floor tilted. So I said, what a decent person says. I told him we weren't aligned, that his intensity made me uncomfortable, that I wished him well far away from me. This was the moment where most people take the loss and exit with whatever dignity they can salvage. Jeff didn't exit. He escalated. The first escalation was spiritual theater. I told him I'd be offline a while. He peppered my inbox with messages for 5 days, then announced he had known all along I was unwell because we had a psychic connection. He described a shared thread of energy, the same Claire link he claimed he'd had with his grandmother. He wasn't joking. He wrote like a prophet, cornered by unbelievers. When I didn't respond, he shifted to medical theater, sharp pains, a dash to the emergency room, low oxygen metaphors, a ticking clock. The first time. I panicked. He vanished for a few hours, then returned with no paperwork, no follow-up. Just relief that I had finally replied. After that, the ER became a button he could press whenever the room went cold, when the medical button dulled. He tried elegy. Every month, a different relative hovered at the edge of death. Grandfather, grandmother, brother, father. None of them died. None of them even stayed sick long enough to be remembered in the next chapter of his performance. He contradicted himself cheerfully. Lived alone. Lived with a roommate who stole from him. Lived with a whole household of invalids depending on him. Inconsistency is a kind of confession too. Facebook turned his private opera into public spectacle. He wrote screeds about generosity and pure intentions, insisted he was incapable of cruelty by nature, then tossed barbs at women for existing wrong and torched fans for not getting it. He hated desire in the abstract, but kept trying to harvest mine. He preached restraint while sending me dim photos of himself in thrift shop hats, demanding essays about angles and jaw lines and whether this one made him look like the lead in a story I hadn't agreed to tell. This is where people usually say, I should have blocked him sooner. I did block him. It didn't stop him. He slid over to Steam with a note. I'm sorry for what I'm about to do. The sentence hovered there, its vagueness a weapon. It wasn't clear whether he meant harm to himself or a mess aimed at me. Geography made the second unlikely. Money made the first unlikely too. But the threat was never about logistics. It was about attention. Nothing catastrophic followed. Drama rarely pays off with the spectacle it promises. Instead, he switched to allegory. On Facebook, he posted about a beautiful songbird in a cage and the duty of the keeper to set her free. He pulled the line from BioShock Infinite. Of course, he cast himself as the stern guardian and me as Elizabeth, the trapped daughter-savior problem. He thought it was romantic. I thought it was proof of the cage he was trying to build around a person he had never met. Pattern interruption. The healthiest thing I did was refuse the metaphor. I told myself a simpler story. There is me. There is a man with a script he keeps rehearsing online. There is a door, and I am allowed to close it. But the body doesn't shut off alarms just because your brain declares the all clear. I still jumped at late-night pings from people who hadn't earned access to me. I still combed my own sentences for hidden consent. That is what sustained harassment does. It teaches you to audit yourself before you speak, to preempt someone else's misreading by shrinking your life to a safe outline. I started narrating my days differently, out loud, to myself, the way you might narrate steps down a dark hallway so you don't have to map it twice. Open laptop. Check messages. Do not reward bait. Answer what is needed. Shut. Lock. Leave. It worked better than I expected, because my voice in plain language could cut through his voice in florid banners. Embedded command isn't always sinister. Sometimes it's how you coach your nervous system back into your body. The last serious message he sent me was another apology for something he wouldn't name. I archived it without reading past the first line. The final post I saw from him was a photo of his new haircut, a buzzed transformation, captioned like a manifesto. He said the old him had been too generous, too open, too easy to wound. He said the new him was done being a door. It was the one time I agreed with him. Doors should close. The lesson arrived late, but it arrived. If this all reads like I'm painting myself as a victim and him as a cartoon, let me correct both impressions. I invited contact. I entertained it past the expiration date. I wanted to see if I could hold my boundaries and prove something about grace under pressure. That desire became the handle he gripped. Predators don't just want access to your body. They want access to your time, your narrative, your need to be seen as generous. Allison and I still laugh in the way survivors laugh, not at the harm, but at the costume. She blocked Jeff sooner than I did. Another friend didn't. She kept collecting his monologues until he asked her to blow up her marriage for the myth he'd built around her. She left. The myth deflated like a party balloon forgotten behind a couch. I used to think safety online meant knowing how to spot the monster under the bridge. Pixelated avatar. Aggressive opening line. A bio that reads like a dare. What I know now is simpler and sharper. Safety is the speed of your no. Safety is not arguing with scripts that don't deserve your breath. Safety is letting the block button be a boundary instead of a courtroom. Here's the anchoring I leave you with, if you've read this far, and recognize even a sliver of your chat history inside mine. You do not owe anyone a performance of curiosity to prove you're open-minded. You do not have to supply context for a boundary. You are not cruel for leaving a stage where the play was written without you. I was wrong to laugh at strangers' stories. Not because their choices were flawless, no one's are, but because the angle of mercy was missing from my view. The truth is that the internet isn't a single place. It's 1,000 small rooms, some with soft chairs and warm light, some with doors that lead exactly where they say, and some built to look like comfort, while the floor quietly tilts under you. The trick isn't to learn how to walk better. It's to learn when to step out and shut the door hard enough that you feel the handle settle. And if a man writes that he is sorry for what he's about to do, believe him, just not in the way he wants. Believe he is about to try one more trick to make you climb back into the cage and call it safety. Then let him perform to an empty room. The echo he hears will be his own voice. Mine isn't in there anymore. Guru's. The first time a stranger told me I was his soulmate, I laughed. The second time, he explained it like a diagnosis. The third time, he said it like a promise. And I understood I was no longer in a conversation. I was in a script I hadn't agreed to read. When I was younger, I lived online, tucked into forums that felt like dorm lounges, threads running all night, avatars aging as slowly as houseplants. I won't name the sites. Archives have a way of resurrecting the worst versions of us. Somewhere between a fan thread and a niche meme page, a username began repeating across my periphery. Baghad, sometimes mistyped as Baghead. A handle that sounded like an inside joke that never had a punchline. He appeared first on Twitter, then in my comments elsewhere. The way weeds learn the looks of a yard and settle in. Back then, I answered anyone. If you said you loved the same webcomic or understood the same obscure band reference, I assumed we had a shared map. He took that map and redrew my borders. We DM'd for a few days. He complimented the ordinary parts of me with the zeal of a man discovering gravity. That I read fast. That I used parentheses sparingly. That I liked old point-and-click games. That I preferred long sleeves, even in spring. There's flattery. And then there's inventory. People who are trying to be with you list what they like. People who are trying to live in you list what they can use. By day 3, he began to escalate the language. Not just admiration, compatibility, not just I like you. We are made for each other. He fed me hypotheticals like he was calibrating us. What we'd watch, how we'd decorate, what time we'd go to sleep, and which side of the bed I'd naturally choose. He said it as if he'd discovered laws, not preferences. I tried to make a joke of it. You're very confident for someone who hasn't heard my sleep apnea playlist. But humor slid off him. There's context you need about me. And I gave it to him early. The way you hand a stranger a boundary at the door so they don't wander the wrong hallway. I told him I wasn't wired for intimacy. Childhood took a wrench to those circuits. Friendship is my speed. I say that in clear words because not saying it invites negotiations I can't stand. He said he understood. He said he had a sister who felt the same, and he admired our strength. I wanted to believe him, because believing someone is kinder than bracing for them. 1 week in, a message landed like a theater curtain, a confession of love that measured itself in paragraphs. If it had stopped there, maybe we could have pressed a reset button. Appreciate your honesty. Let's be decent. But he didn't stop. He included explicit, wandering descriptions of acts we had never discussed, and that I had told him my life does not contain. He attached a drawing, amateur anime lines on a stolen selfie of me, posing a body I don't have as a person I'm not. My stomach turned like a drawer that won't close. I wrote what felt like a grown-up response. I don't want this. I don't do this. I want friendship or nothing. He replied, not with apology, but with a performance of self-hatred, so flamboyant it demanded an audience. He declared himself broken, ruined, poison. He threaded despair through every platform he had, swearing he damaged me and every beautiful thing he touched. If you've never been on the receiving end of this routine, it works like a trap. The worse he says he is, the more you feel compelled to prove he isn't. So the conversation never ends. I was young enough to take the bait. I reassured him. I said we were fine. I thanked him for trusting me with his feelings. I told myself compassion is not consent. I did not yet understand the way pity can be engineered into a leash. He weaponized confession. When that dulled, he weaponized his reflection. After the apology tour exhausted itself, photos started arriving, each one a study in arrested adolescence. At first, they were headshots, a face framed by long, unkempt hair, an expression he must have practiced in the mirror for months, practiced so hard it no longer looked like a feeling. He wanted feedback on the shape of his jaw, on his eyes, on whether he should grow his hair even longer, like artists do. I told him he looked fine, because what else do you say to a stranger who is asking you to bless his bone structure? Then the frame widened, collarbones, then a chest as pale as office paper, the edge of a bathroom counter creeping into shots like a supporting character. He wanted adjectives. He wanted praise parceled out in precise doses. Polite answers encouraged him, the way crumbs tell a pigeon there's more where that came from. Every time I tried to pivot the chat, books, work, weather, he steered back to the mirror, as if leaving it would cause him to cease existing. I tried a boundary that I thought even a teenager could parse. I said I was uncomfortable with the shirtless photos. I said it kindly. Mastering that tone, women learn to use so a man won't hear a challenge and respond with a demolition. I suggested he keep selfies casual, not staged in the bathroom, not so naked. He heard it as a confirmation of everything he feared and everything he needed. New fuel. His meltdown arrived on schedule, extravagant and self-directed. He announced that he should carve words into his chest, that he should dismantle his face, that he should remove the parts of himself that wanted. He sent voice notes that sounded like a person screaming into a pillow, and typed as if pounding the keys could substitute for changing himself. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived this pattern that even when you know a threat is theater, your body still pays the ticket price. Again, I reassured him. Again. He calmed. He said he was embarrassed, grateful, reformed. He lasted 2 days before returning with a request disguised as medical wisdom. His confidence was gone. He said the only cure he could imagine was validation from a woman he trusted. If I could tell him his unclothed body was attractive, it would help him get mentally healthy. That was the moment the script lost any plausible deniability. He was asking for pornography with a doctor's note. That was the line for me. I told him, gently and firmly, that I do not do that for anyone. I told him to save those requests for a partner who had agreed to them in clear terms. Then I hid offline the way you step out of a bar when a conversation has become a fire alarm. My absence made him prolific. He took his anguish public again, writing that he was a blight, that he hurt everyone he loved, that he was toxic. He didn't say my name, but we both understood who the audience was meant to be. Misra, doom scrolling, collecting guilt like parking tickets under the wiper. A few days later, he sent an offline message asking if I was okay. I told him I was dealing with PTSD and that I needed quiet. He said he understood and that he would give me space. The relief was like air after a long swim. It lasted until the next morning. The email subject line said, "To cheer you up." What it contained was not cheer. It was leverage. A video file. No explanation beyond those 4 words. I didn't open it. I asked him what it was. He answered with the bluntness of a person who thinks honesty is the same as goodness. He had filmed himself gratifying himself for me. He wrote as if he were handing me a fruit basket, a neighborly gesture. I felt a cold clarity. Anger without heat. He had learned nothing about me except where I could be made to flinch. I told him I wouldn't watch it. I reminded him of the boundaries I'd already set and the reasons why. I mentioned childhood without detail. He didn't apologize. He pivoted to pedagogy, lecturing me about how engaging with his body would help mine, how exposure was therapeutic, how this single act could fix what he imagined was broken in me. When manipulative men learn a little language about trauma, they turn it into a crowbar. I repeated myself, "No." He pretended not to understand and returned to the narrative where he alone could heal what he believed I refused to name. He did not know me well enough to know that stubbornness is how I survived childhood. I can outweight a weather system if I have to. So I stopped responding. I kept him on follow because I feared the fireworks if he saw the block as an insult, and because a part of me thought observing him might keep me safer than ignorance would. I watched him oscillate between contrition and rage. He wrote thousands of words about generosity and betrayal, about giving everything and receiving indifference. The hero of every sentence was the same person. He shifted strategies. If despair didn't summon me, then righteous anger might. He railed about a woman who had manipulated him, trampled his heart, spat on his kindness. He framed himself as a reservoir you could drain and still expect water from. He never used my name. But by now, he had trained me to hear myself in all his speeches. The genius of vague accusations is that every sensitive person recognizes themselves right away. My patience thinned to thread. I wrote him one last message, not to soothe, but to separate. I told him the truth. The feed was hurting my mind. I would unfollow and block to protect myself. I asked him to leave me alone. I offered no public spectacle as a trade. I clicked unfollow. I waited an hour so the message would register. Then I blocked. For a few days, my phone was quiet. I slept with my jaw unclenched. I believed, foolishly, that endings can be clean if you write them neatly enough. Then a friend texted me a screenshot. He promised a Monday that would change everything, and my body believed him before my brain could argue. In a series of posts, he announced that he was finished being walked over, done being used. On Monday, he wrote, the world would see a different man. The person who had trampled him would witness consequences. He didn't say what or who. The ambiguity did the work for him. Anxiety colonizes imagination. My mind sketched possibilities like a panicked storyboard. A dox, a drive to my town, a doorbell at night. I didn't know his legal name or address, just the state, which is both a very big and a very small piece of information. I told my mother. I told a relative who works as a cop without a name. There's little to file. But telling made me feel less like a single target and more like a person with witnesses. Sunday passed like a held breath. Monday arrived, and I learned that threats don't need to be violent to be insulting. His big reveal was a haircut. He filmed himself turning toward a mirror to show a regimented buzz cut where his long hair had been, announcing that this was the new him, the moment he became a serious man who would never again allow his heart to be trampled. It was theater for an audience he had manufactured in his head. The danger level dropped, but the contempt I felt rose. His consequences were cosmetic. If you've never been stalked emotionally, the letdown after anticipated harm can be disorienting. Your nervous system has nowhere to put the adrenaline it has baked. It curdles into exhaustion. I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet of my apartment and realized I had spent days preparing for a catastrophe that became a barbershop appointment. I told myself to take the win. The win being that he had chosen vanity over violence. I blocked every account, not as a performance, but as a hygiene ritual. If he was going to monologue, he could do it in a room I never visited again. I did not post about him. I did not gather allies to mock him. I did something that looks like nothing. I resumed ordinary life, which is a defiance some men will never forgive. What lingers after someone does not harm you can be stranger than harm itself. For months, I carried a shape in my ribs that looked like being on guard. I kept the blinds angled. I learned the sound of my own building's door and convinced myself it belonged to me. I practiced sentences in case I had to explain myself to an officer who didn't understand how online becomes outside. I didn't want to file a report without a name. I didn't want to waste anyone's time. I kept my proof anyway. Screenshots stacked like index cards in a folder on my desktop, labeled with his handle. Friends asked for the short version, and I gave it. A man decided I was his soulmate when I refused to be the altar he needed. He performed grief until I almost believed I'd killed something. The longer version includes the useful vocabulary I wish I'd had earlier. Trauma bonding done to you, not with you. Coercive control with compliments. Self-harm threats as social engineering. Therapy speak as a pry bar. The words don't change what happened, but they give you handholds on the climb back to yourself. Every now and then, I thought about the sister he claimed, the one who understood me. Maybe she exists. Maybe she doesn't. I learned to hear how often men borrow women as props to build trust they haven't earned. The one time I looked. Months later, his feed had become devotional. Gym sets. Protein. Quotes about discipline pasted over sunsets. Rebranding is easier than repair. He looked like a man building an audience out of mirrors and calling it progress. I closed the tab. Recovery sometimes means choosing not to research your own past. I wish I could say there was a dramatic ending. The truth is small and therefore difficult to make cinematic. Nothing happened. He stayed on his side of the screen. I stayed on mine. I deleted the folder one day when I realized I hadn't opened it in a season. I didn't need the evidence anymore to convince myself it had been real. Some stories end with a siren. Mine ends with a haircut and a decision I make again every day. When you've been told you are someone's only cure, your job for the rest of your life is to remember that you are not. I learned to recognize the early tremors of a certain kind of man. The ones who speak in absolutes, who build romances out of borrowed lines, who turn your boundaries into their stage directions. If this is the first story you've heard, like mine, I want the lesson to be less about danger and more about permission. You do not owe anyone your time because they narrated themselves into your life. If you're tempted to manage someone's feelings at the expense of your own, call it by its right name: unpaid labor. And if a person keeps telling you who they are, believe them even when they say it in the key of self-loathing. I still live online, just less loudly. I still make friends. I have learned to ask for their last names. I still keep my empathy, but I do not mistake it for consent to be someone's mirror. When I see a buzz cut on a timeline, I sometimes think of him, and then I think of every woman who has weathered a meltdown meant to keep her in orbit. I wish us all the quiet courage of logging off without explanation. This is the most accurate ending I can give you. I never saw him in person. He never found my door. He tried to draft me into his life's mythology. I declined the role. The only scar is the one that teaches me to say no faster. The only audience he kept was himself. And that, for once, is enough of a consequence.